The theme of my talk, and the reason we're making the documentary, from Hengist to Harper, is that Magna Carta is not just something good that happened in the past, something interesting, something we might learn lessons from and want to imitate. It is the foundation of the kind of society that we live in today, in which people have room to dream, to act, to make things a reality, even in such things we might take for granted as the fact that you can have this organization have a meeting. You know, there are parts of the world where if there were such an organization as this, it would either be a front for the secret police or it would be infiltrated and crushed by them. And when people think that the essence of public policy is innovation, change, that we need to do things differently, as though government were like an operating system, and if you're still using iOS 6, you're a hopeless chump and a loser, and in fact life won't really be meaningful till we get Windows 10, and then at last we can start to fulfill our human potential. They don't understand how fundamentally what we have today relies upon what was created in the past and defended in the past. And the challenge of preserving these rights today is part of a long, dramatic, and exciting story. And looking ahead a little bit to the question, how do we get our message out? One of the things about fighting for freedom is that it offers people, including young people who've been starved of their history, an adventure. If you explain to them the story they're part of, the improbability of it, the heroism of it, the great lines that have been uttered at critical moments by people who put their lives on the line to defend the rights that make a flourishing society possible, that will engage them in a way that I think that what the ersatz history they're given today just doesn't. Now, if we go to the next slide and play the video, again, technology is our friend. You have to get on over till the little play button appears, and then with any luck it'll play. Many of you will already have seen our pitch for the Kickstarter documentary. And I should mention, by the way, we have made our target. There was some thought when Danny invited me that we would lock you in the room and not let you out until you helped us reach our 75,000. Well, we have reached it, and we are enormously grateful. I consider this not merely, obviously from my own point of view, this is excellent, but it's a vindication of a free society that we could put this together and make it happen. Go ahead. I can interrupt myself. Sure. You can't, I can. Magna Carta is the foundation of our liberties. It's why we have rights. Now, that may seem like an eccentric thing to say about a document that's 800 years old this year. It's so ancient that it was written in Latin on vellum and sealed in wax. And it has no formatting. We're lucky there's any punctuation. But the core elements of decent public order are in there, especially a fair system of law, one that applies equally to everybody. Security of the person and of possessions. The state cannot rob or murder you. The right to a say in the laws under which you live, including the tax laws. The whole idea that citizens own the government instead of the other way around, it's in Magna Carta. And remarkably, the free men who brought bad King John to heel at Runnymede and made him put his seal on it weren't looking forward imaginatively, they weren't projecting. They believed they were protecting ancient liberties that had been challenged by the king and needed to be written down more clearly and more firmly so they would last. And it worked. The liberties in Magna Carta were challenged again and again, but every time they were squeezed, they weren't broken, they were put into a harder and sharper form.
In 2010, while a copy of Magna Carta was on display in the Manitoba legislature, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II unveiled a stone from Runnymede that became the actual cornerstone of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. You see, when we say that Magna Carta is the foundation of our liberties, we mean that literally.
The law wasn't perfect back in 1215, of course. It had to be refined and adapted. The protective circle that it drew was too narrow, sometimes tragically so. But within that circle, there was a political order worth cherishing, worth defending, worth extending, and worth imitating. How could there be liberty under law in England coming out of the Dark Ages when it didn't exist in most of the world and in too many places tragically still doesn't? How was it able to withstand the challenges that overwhelmed it, even in most of Europe in subsequent centuries? How did it work in practice? How does it affect us today? What threats and challenges exist to this system now? And how can we be sure that we will pass on to our posterity the blessings of liberty that we inherited from our ancestors? Please help me to tell the remarkable story of Magna Carta, the cornerstone and foundation of our rights and liberties. The difficult part of the pitch to the average person is, how can it be that a document so old that it's written on sheepskin in shorthand Latin without any formatting, there are no bullets, it wasn't done in PowerPoint, how could this still matter today? And the first part of the answer is when you look into Magna Carta and you see that it says nullus liber homo capiatur vel et imprisonatur out, and people go, wow, that's just terrific, or else they go, excuse me, but that was not a language I speak because it's in Latin. True, but it's from the original 1215 Magna Carta, clause 39. It says, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, outlawed, exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. That is to say, it guarantees due process to everybody. And this idea that the rules need to be fair is something that is cherished, I think, by everybody in Canada. You wouldn't get dissent on that point, at least certainly not in principle, from, it doesn't matter which political party or leader you went to. Oh yes, that's part of what makes Canada great. What confuses a lot of people, though, is the idea that this was something we only thought of recently, maybe with the Charter of Rights, that before that there was darkness, oppression, and exclusion. And you can't tell the story without being frank. Yes, there were some people who were not covered by something that was promised to all free men. And part of the story of the last 800 years has been extending the circle of protections. But that's only an important story if the circle of protections itself is valuable. And it is. In fact, in Magna Carta, there's more about process. Without due process, it doesn't matter what fancy rules you're offered. It doesn't matter, in the French Revolution, what they tell you you're going to get, because they don't give you any way to access it. These wonderful things are behind a locked, bulletproof pane of glass, but not in England. One of the rules is that the ordinary court shall not follow the royal court around, but shall be held in a fixed place. And this is extremely important because Henry II, the almost great Bad King John's father, somebody once tried to figure out his travels in the course of 1 year. He, of course, had extensive land holdings in France. In fact, he cared more about France than England. He was properly Henri II. He did not speak a word of English. And they figured that he traveled about 2,000 miles, with his court scrambling to keep up with him, and it's all on horseback or on foot. Obviously he had an iron constitution and an iron backside. But if you're an average English serf with a legal issue, you can't chase the king around Brittany and Normandy, but you don't have to, because the courts come to where you are and give everyone justice. And that's extremely important. And what is this justice? Well, another clause 28 of the original, no constable or other royal official shall take corn or other movable goods from any man without immediate payment unless the seller voluntarily offers postponement of this. This is property rights. Right there, no taking without compensation. And again, it's promised to everyone. This is not just for the rich, the powerful, and the well-connected. It's for everybody. The king's soldiers can't just show up and say, there's a battle going on, it's really important, very sorry, have to take your food. It's not allowed. An even more extraordinary thing that appears in the original Magna Carta in 1215, Clause 12, no scutage or aid may be levied in our kingdom without its general consent, except for certain specified purposes like marrying the eldest daughter of the king once. Remember, King John was a slippery character. He'd have married his daughter off 13 times if he could have raised a bunch of money from the nobles every time. Now, scutage, again, is not probably top of your list of public concerns, but fundamentally, scutage and aid are raising of money. And so Magna Carta says there shall be no taxation without the consent of the governed. And that's an amazing thing to find in this document, especially because you may be thinking to yourself, but how is this consent to be determined? There's no such thing as a parliament in 1215. There are these occasional gatherings of the wise men going back into the mists of time, the Wittengemot, but it's not a corporate body with rules and procedures able to summon itself. So this is obviously kind of a nebulous right, but at the core of it is something that is not at all nebulous. It is that the law in England comes from the English. And the rules under which they live are the rules under which they have agreed to live. And one of the ways that this happened, I called Henry II the almost great, and one of the reasons why is his courts. Henry was in something of a power struggle with the feudal nobility over who would dispense justice. And the king, by and large, won this fight, not with his sword, but with courts that were better than their rivals. And Henry's courts would go out, they would impanel a jury in some, whatever it was in England, some dispute has arisen, and they would ask the jurors on your oath and on your honor, what is the law? And once they knew what the law was, they would say, and what are the facts in this case, and who's guilty and who's innocent. But the first part of that, what is the law? That Henry, this is judge-made law, but not in the sense that we know and hate it today. Rather, the judges are going out and finding out what the rules are under which the English have always consented to be governed. And where does this come from? It doesn't come from the king. The king's word is not law in England. Nor is there a parliament. It is the customs of the people. This is popular sovereignty. What the Americans were attempting to enshrine in 1789 was not some innovation on their part, but what they understood to always to have been the rule in the English-speaking world. And in my view, they were absolutely right. Now, another surprise, if we can scroll on, I think I was meant to call for those two and didn't. So we'll pass on. Oh, no, one more here, which is just very important. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. More of this due process stuff. And this is one of these points, a rallying cry today. Have you ever had to contemplate going to court? Well, if you do, you discover that the process is incredibly time-consuming, mind-bogglingly expensive, and something of a throw of the dice. This is a violation of a key right in Magna Carta, I think. I mean, obviously, to sell injustice, the first thought was the king shouldn't take bribes to decide a case. And again, knowing King John, this was a very important thing to nail down. But more fundamentally, this idea of a legal system that is accessible to ordinary people, not just to the rich, powerful, and well-connected. That is something everybody still agrees with today, and it's one of those places where we can say we need to get back to Magna Carta. So there's somebody is wronged by a neighbor, by somebody rich, powerful, and well-connected, or indeed by a government official. The legal remedy isn't just available in theory, but is available in fact. Now we'll go to the next one, because this is even more surprising. Women's rights. Magna Carta contains a couple of clauses intended to protect women. At her husband's death, a widow may have her marriage portion and inheritance at once and without trouble. In short, the king's men can't come in and grab the stuff, because, again, John was always trying to take his citizens' property. He was in desperate financial trouble all the time, as were all the kings. And Richard Lionheart, his brother, who somehow has become a great hero through the Robin Hood stories, was really in many ways no better than John. Richard once said he would sell London if he could find a buyer. And, a ripple of uneasy laughter around the room because he was quite serious about that. And no widow should be compelled to marry as long as she wishes to remain without a husband. Again, because if she marries, the man gets her property. And again, John will certainly seize some rich widow and make her marry one of his friends. Well, Magna Carta promises that you cannot do that. Now again, in dealing with Magna Carta, we do not wish to compose a historical fiction. There are clauses in Magna Carta that are very troubling. Particularly, there's the clause about people who die owing money to the Jews. And apparently you don't have to pay in full. And you think, well, this is outrageous, and it is. But it's even worse than it sounds. Because Jews in England at this time did not have normal legal standing. They were, in a very real sense, possessions of the king. And they couldn't own land. So if some noble dies having borrowed money from Jewish moneylenders, and by and large that's who they borrowed from because of the prohibition on usury for Christians, then their land goes through the Jews to the king. So again, what this is in the short run is an attempt to stop King John from bagging all the stuff. He was forever trying to do it, as I say. But obviously behind that is the fact that Jews were not given proper protection of the law. The protective circle of Magna Carta is not drawn broadly enough. And part of what happens in the next 800 years is a long struggle to improve that. It doesn't go well at first. In fact, Edward I expels the Jews from England. Just as you all get out, and then they're all expelled from France. The Jews are not allowed back until Oliver Cromwell. So I'm not going to pretend that everything is perfect in Magna Carta, but much in Magna Carta is good, and the foundations are there for improving it. In fact, one of the reasons, as we are going into the 800th anniversary celebrations, there are a number of copies of Magna Carta out there of different issues because the document was issued in slightly different forms repeatedly over a number of years. And one of the reasons why we still have them is that Edward I, who like most of the kings at that time, was not a man lightly to be crossed. This is the hated Longshanks of Braveheart. But under Edward, it was promised. He not only confirmed Magna Carta 11 times, under duress most of the time, that anything done contrary to Magna Carta is null and void. That you have here a fundamental law of the land which statute law cannot go against. Again, the American model is drawn on this. Also, it was read aloud in the cathedrals twice a year, translated into English so that the illiterate peasant would know his rights or her rights. And when a new version was issued, it was sent around to the cathedrals and the monks were told to throw out the old one, but luckily the monks were sometimes pack rats, and that is why we have various different copies intact. But again, because of this obsession that new is better and that history is a story of progress, that fundamentally there was a long and tedious and dismal preparation for our appearance on the scene, and finally light shall burst forth, perhaps around the time that Pierre Trudeau becomes Prime Minister, a number of scholars will look at Magna Carta and say, yeah, sure, that's pretty good, but you know what, this was just an elite deal, this wasn't for everybody. Eventually we forced the nobles to admit that the common man had rights, but this is contrary to the historical record. The fact that it is read again and again out loud so everyone can know that it talks about all free men. Repeatedly, this phrase appears in the confirmations and in the charter itself. It's for everybody, and Edward Cook will talk about this later, as we'll see. But before we go forward, I promised you Hengist, and I do not wish to swindle you. And particularly because Thomas Jefferson wanted Hengist and Horsa to be on the Great Seal of the United States. Now, Hengist and Horsa were thought to have been the first Saxon rulers of England after the collapse of Roman Britain. And I should say, historical research has suggested that Horsa, he has two unpleasant options. Either he didn't exist at all or he was Hengist's horse. Either way, I very much doubt he was ever king of any part of England. Hengist, well, he probably did exist and he probably was the king. He may not have been the nicest man in the world. But the fact that Jefferson would look back to him is part of this larger tradition, which is quite sound, of looking backward. I don't mean just now looking back to Magna Carta, but when Magna Carta itself was sealed, what the barons and prelates and knights and everybody who brought John to heel at Runnymede were trying to do was not figure out some new way that we should govern ourselves. Hey, wouldn't it be great if people had rights? What they were doing is saying, we've always had these rights. And John is a usurping tyrant, and he is taking away the rights that have belonged to Englishmen from time immemorial, and he's not going to get away with it. They were inspired in part by the coronation oath of Henry I. Henry I is John's great-grandfather. He becomes king in 1100. He's the second son of William the Conqueror. And Henry's coronation oath promises the English the good old laws of Edward, Alfred, and Ethelbert of Kent. There's Edward the Confessor, who's the last Saxon king other than Harold Godwinson, the guy with the arrow in his eye at Hastings. And Alfred the Great is king of Wessex in the Dark Ages, and we'll get to Alfred in a moment too, because among other things, again, to talk about the American Revolution, when the American colonists revolt and they scrape together a navy, they've got 4 entire ships and converted merchantmen, which they're going to go up against the Royal Navy, which is down to its last, 250 first-rate warships. They call their flagship the Alfred, for Alfred the Great, who fought off the Danes, forced their king to convert to Christianity, recaptured London, and then as an adult taught himself Latin so that he could translate important books into Anglo-Saxon because he felt that learning in his kingdom was in decline. And he also revamped the English navy so that it could fight off the Danish invaders. An extraordinary man, the only king known as the Great in English history. Ethelbert of Kent rules in the 7th century. His is the first extant law code of which a copy survives. So at the time of Magna Carta, people are looking back 500 years for the origins of good government. Magna Carta is 800 years old, but it's pointing back another 500 years. And this understanding, it's quite remarkable. We'll go ahead to the next slide. I think it's the next one. Oh yes, John of Salisbury. This is before Magna Carta. In fact, this is under Henry II. He is a clerk to the Thomas of Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's murdered by the king, and it causes the king great trouble. And his little textbook on political economy, Polycraticus, he says the difference between the prince and the tyrant is that the prince obeys the law and governs his people in accordance with right. And again, this is a remarkable sentiment when you understand that in most of the world, you couldn't utter this phrase, A, because you'd get your head knocked off, but B, because the law is whatever the prince says it is. This would be incoherent in Tsarist Russia or in the Mongol Empire, because how could the prince not obey the law? Whatever the prince does is law. And there's no parliament. And yet this is uncontroversial. He states this at court. He publishes it, and people go, yes, that's right. He also says, not only is it lawful to slay the tyrant, but also it is right and just to do it. So in the 12th century, an English writer can tell a king, if you do not follow the law, you ought to die, and we are the people who will see to it that, in fact, you do die. And instead of getting himself beheaded, he lives a life of honor, and he survives to old age, unlike Thomas Becket, who got on the wrong side of the king in a way that the king later regretted. So again, this is, and Daniel Hannan talks about this in his book, Inventing Freedom. This phrase, the law of the land, is a remarkable one because it suggests that from the earliest times, before we have any real written record of how it happened, law comes from the people in England, and the law requires that they be treated properly. You can find all kinds of statements anywhere you want to go in the world about how it would be great if the king was not a fink. Confucius talks about how excellent it would be to have good government and has some thoughts on what it would mean. But what he says has very little to do with the course of Chinese history. It doesn't happen there. In England, it does happen. And on the next slide, this is Edward Coke, who is a hero of the struggle against the Stuarts in the 17th century. And in his commentaries on the law of England, he talks about the charter, and this is Henry III talking, John's son. We've also given to all freemen of our realm. And then he says, this includes all persons ecclesiastical and temporal incorporate, politic, or natural, nay, they extend also to villains, that is, to serfs. For they are accounted free against all men saving against the lords. That is, they have feudal obligations they must perform. But that doesn't mean they are not covered by the law. So it is very clear to everybody at the time that England is a free country, and that freedom here means law that comes from the people and protects them from government, protects them from tyranny. And I have a quotation that I like to start my American history courses with. I say there's a commentator on constitutional affairs who described his own country as a land, perhaps the only one in the universe, in which political or civil liberty is the very end and scope of the Constitution. I say, now that, here we are in Canada, but we're doing American history. This is a very American sentiment, right? So this is the way Americans talk, swaggering down the street as they do it. But that's a British writer, William Blackston, in the 1760s, and he's talking about England. Just as the American Revolution is gathering force, he is reminding his fellow in England, and also perhaps in government, because Blackston is very widely read, including by the colonists, that freedom is the essence of the what we would now call the Anglosphere identity. John Milton in 1649 called London the Mansion House of Liberty. And this is considered unremarkable at the time. In fact, the American Revolution, which has fought over the issue of the British Crown ceasing to respect important laws about rules under Magna Carta, at the height of the fighting in 1780, there's a resolution introduced in the British House of Commons, and it says, be it resolved that the power of the Crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be decreased. And it passed during the war. Fundamentally, the House of Commons, which back then was on a very unreformed franchise and leaning very much in the Tory and Royalist direction, told the king, essentially, the colonists are right. You have ceased to govern according to the system under which we have always lived. Now, how did this come about? Again, it's one thing to have it written down in Magna Carta and say, well, wouldn't it be lovely if? But a lot of people have said a lot of good things. When I was young, I wanted to be tall. We see where that got me. Well, after John is forced to seal Magna Carta, he immediately tries to go back on the deal, raises war against the barons, and dies of a surfeit of new ale and peaches, or possibly of dysentery, or maybe somebody poisoned him. Anyway, nobody's sorry to see him go, so they don't inquire too closely into the nature of his demise. And he is succeeded by his son Henry III, who has a very long and pointless reign in England. He's a bad king, he's profligate, he's not so much tyrannical as weak, he's regularly berated by all and sundry for his extravagant habits. And indeed, in the 1260s, Simon de Montfort raises a rebellion against Henry on behalf of the barons. And as the battle is going on, back and forth, seesaw, Simon needs to do something to guarantee his legitimacy. So what he does is he summons a parliament. In 1265, and again, you get your barons and earls and various associated big shots in their ermine robes, and you get your bishops and archbishops and so on, and 2 knights from every shire and 2 burgesses from the towns. He includes the commoners in his parliament. Because if the common people are not represented, you do not have political legitimacy. Now, this goes... Simon actually manages to capture both Henry III and his son Edward, but this is the later Edward I. But Edward escapes, ambushes Simon, kills him, cuts his head off, does things to his body that I can never describe in public. And then when Henry dies in 1272, Edward becomes king. And what does he do? He summons parliaments. And his parliaments include the common people. The king cannot stop doing this. And in 1297, in a statute, again, we're still talking Latin here in laws, de tillagio non concedendo, he promises no taxation without the consent of Parliament. So that rather amorphous thing in Magna Carta in 1215 becomes statute law by 1297. And the American revolutionaries, again, when they say no taxation without representation, they don't think they invented it. They know perfectly well that they are going back almost 500 years. They're doing it on purpose. And then the House of Commons starts sitting separately. Nobody really gives them permission. We don't quite know when it happened. We don't even know where they met, anywhere they could find a place to put their muddy feet, apparently. But we know by 1346 that the Commons is sitting separately from the Lords, including the church potentates. By 1376, the Commons are electing their own speaker, because the speaker controls the schedule, counts the votes, and critically, this odd thing about our system, the speaker's the guy who doesn't speak. What happened? Did they not have a dictionary? No, he's the one person who speaks to the other branches about the affairs of the House of Commons and tells what bill passed and what it said. So the Commons secures control of their own affairs, and this is very important because in 1401, when Henry IV has just seized the throne, Richard II having been pushed off the throne and then disappeared under mysterious circumstances. And one of the reasons why Richard turns up dead is that he had said, the law is in my mouth. That is, as king, my word is law. And in England, that is not true. That is a deadly thing to say if you're king. So Henry IV takes the throne, but there's a little bit of, is this guy really king? And Parliament says, yeah, we can confirm that you're the king, but in return, here's what you're going to do. When we gather in Parliament and we present you with petitions or grievances, we say something is wrong, we need you to fix it, you're going to answer us before we give you any money. So the power of the purse appears. Then in 1407, there was an argument about a tax bill, and the Commons tells the House of Lords, we have primacy on tax bills because we represent the people who have to pay for this mess. And in 1415, just as Henry V is off to Agincourt, Parliament says to him, we have noticed something that is displeasing to us. We come, we present you with these grievances and petitions, you give us an answer, we give you money, we go home, and then you whip out the old quill and you start changing the wording. Well, no more of that. From now on, the text, when we leave, is the text as it stands permanently. And so there you have the system that we have today, where Parliament controls the executive by controlling spending. Primacy on money bills lies with the House of Commons. That's still true in Britain today, and in Canada, and in the United States. Spending and revenue bills must originate in the lower house of the bicameral Parliament. All of this is in place by 1415, and it's all there because men put their lives on the line. And when I say men, don't forget, their wives knew what was going on, and their wives were in on the whole deal and knew they'd be facing the same punishment if this all turned out badly, put their lives on the line to say, you cannot take money from your subjects without proper authorization from the representatives of the people. And this is why we still have it. This is what the story's about. And you look over in Europe at this time, there are a number of organizations that look vaguely like Parliament. The French Parlement, the Spanish Cortes, these various Landtags and so on in Germany, all of which seem to have some kind of power similar to the English Parliament, but they're all crushed by the rise of absolutist princes. The Parlement in France, the three estates, hadn't met for 150 years before the French Revolution at all. But in Britain, the exact opposite happens. The scariest person you're ever going to get, pretty much here, is Henry VIII. An absolutely alarming man. I mean, one of my rules of thumb about history, do not marry Henry VIII. But it goes beyond that. He's an authentically frightening individual. And he, on more than one occasion, told the Speaker of the House, either you pass my bill or you die. And he could actually do it. He could throw you in the tower, you could mysteriously disappear, all kinds of things. Well, in 1539, he presents Parliament with a statute of proclamations, which says essentially the king's word is law. We are going to undo all this stuff. We are going to have absolutism in England. And Parliament says, well, yeah, okay, but we have an amendment here. And the amendment says that your proclamations are law unless they affect our inheritances, lawful possessions, offices, liberties, privileges, franchise, goods, or chattels, and you may not infringe any acts, common laws, or lawful and laudable customs. So now you see it, now you don't. They defy Henry VIII to his face and say, no, your word is not law. Law comes from Parliament. And eventually the Tudors fizzle out, a miserable dynasty that spent more time pursuing the throne than obtaining it. I mean, they did go out on a high note with Elizabeth I. But the crown then passes to the Royal House of Scotland, the Stuarts, because of the royal marriage of James IV to Henry VII's sister, if memory serves correctly. And the Stuarts don't get it. Starting with James I, who had spent his life planning, well, James VI, if you're Scottish, okay, to become king of a united Britain, but who didn't understand English law. And when he's coming down south to be crowned, there are huge crowds on, everybody's having a good time, but somebody's caught picking pockets, stealing purses, and James has him hanged without a trial. And right away, alarm bells go off. So, no, you can't do that in England. And James hates Parliament. He meets with it as rarely as possible. When he does meet with it, he hectors it. At one point, he complains to him. He says, the Parliament in Scotland listens to me as their king and their counsellor and does what I say. Here you seem to have nothing else to do than find fault with me. Now, yes. Okay, you figured that out at last. And James is a curious character. He was once described by a rival monarch as the wisest fool in Christendom. And he has a certain cunning that serves him in a tight corner. So he avoids Parliament most of the time by not getting into wars, which are the main cause of royal expenditure. And he more or less thus gets away with his attitudes, although he finally summons a Parliament in 1620, I think it is. And he tells them you can't discuss foreign policy. Foreign policy is the king's prerogative. So, of course, the Parliament immediately has a lively debate on James's foreign policy and how wretched it is. The king comes in person, rips the page out of their journal in which the debate was recorded and disperses them again. And that page is still on display in Westminster. But he never makes himself master of England. And in fact, I mentioned Edward Coke. There's a famous incident. Coke is at this point, he's been Solicitor General, Attorney General, Speaker of the Commons, and eventually they decide to get him onto the bench so that he'll stop being part of Parliament, and he's head of the Court of Common Pleas, that is the civil court. And there are church courts in Britain that are very much under the king's thumb, and so James is always trying to transfer cases over to the church courts so he can get his way, and Coke keeps issuing writs saying, no, if the case has civil as well as religious implications, you can't take it away. And finally the king is so angry that he summons Coke, because James thinks of himself as a great intellectual and he wants to debate with him, and the debate turns ugly, because at some point Coke says that the king says he would protect the law, and Coke says, no, the common law protects the king. A traitorous speech, James shouts, flies into a fury. Cook's life is in the balance. He throws himself to the ground and begs for mercy. So do all his friends and backers at court. And finally the king is appeased and goes off hunting, because James likes to go hunting. So Coke gets up, goes back to his court. The next morning he issues another writ forbidding an ecclesiastical court from taking over a case. He goes right back to what he'd been doing. An act of extraordinary courage. James then kicks him upstairs to the king's bench and makes him head of the criminal court. When that doesn't work, he throws him in the Tower of London. But he never murders him, and he never destroys his papers, Cook's lengthy writings on the subject of the Constitution. Then James dies, just in time in a way, and his son Charles takes over, who has his father's attitudes but not his cunning. Charles tries to govern without Parliament. Charles gets into a series of wars, and in the end, of course, what results is that Parliament and the king find themselves at war with one another, and Charles is going to lose his head. But before he does that, in 1649, so the next slide here, in 1642, Charles I leads a band of armed men into Parliament, seeking 5 MPs who are prominent opposition leaders. The Speaker of the Commons, William Lenthal, is dragged from his chair. The king sits in it, and he says, "Where are they? Where are those 5 men?" And the Speaker, again, with his life in serious peril, responds, "May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am." And Lenthal survives. The king retreats in embarrassment. But this is why, to this day, agents of the crown may not enter the Commons chamber, why the throne speech always goes through that ritual where someone knocks on the door and has it slammed in his face. Then they go and they meet in the Senate chamber, because the House of Commons is off limits. All of this comes out of this part of our history. And there's another interesting episode from the Civil War. In 1647, London is captured by the parliamentary forces, and their commander, Sir Thomas Fairfax, says, "Bring me the greatest treasure in the Tower of London." And he's not talking about the crown or the jewels or any of that. It's a copy of Magna Carta. And both sides claim that is what they are fighting for. And in the course of all this unfolding, and this is Edward Cook's last hurrah, and why we need a statue of Cook on Parliament Hill, one of his maxims about law is that for out of the old fields must come the new corn. That is to say that if we are to have extensions of our rights, improvements on the law, they must come from the foundations of Magna Carta and of popular sovereignty. And in next slide, this is, again, looking ahead to the American Revolution, but this is William Pitt the Elder, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, explaining the core of the English system. "The poorest man may in his cottage bid defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, its roof may shake, the wind may blow through it, the storm may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. A man's home is his castle." And again, in the American Revolution, in a technical sense, the writs of assistance, the Quartering Act, this was being violated in various ways. But what was being violated is a precept cherished by the British as well as by the Americans. Now, the next slide again, this is Edward Cook at a critical moment early in the reign of Charles I, and Parliament is debating the extent to which the king does or does not possess prerogative. And the House of Lords is wavering, and they want to say that, yeah, there's a certain undefined but significant power in the hands of the king to do things. And Cook says no. He says, "Magna Carta is such a fellow that he will have no sovereign." That is to say that Magna Carta stands above statute law, even law passed by Parliament and signed by the king. If it contravenes Magna Carta, it's null and void, just exactly as in the United States, a law that runs contrary to the Constitution is null and void. So Cook is expressing what by now would be thought of as bizarre heresy in Britain, and yet at the time was orthodox, that the rights of the people set the constitutional framework within which laws are made, and no laws can be made that contravene the rights of the people. And going along with this, in a case in 1765, Lord Camden, there's another famous principle of British law. Our law knows nothing of state necessity. That is, nothing may be done that is contrary to the law just because it is urgent that it be done, which is very different from how things are done even in other countries that do have democratic elections. Now, what is happening in the American Revolution, and this again is, I think, is very pertinent to what is happening to us today, is that the Hanover Kings, after the second Stuart, the Stuarts alternate wise fools and foolish ones. So after Charles I is beheaded, you get the Commonwealth, and then they decide this is no good, it's unbalanced. They bring back Charles II, who enjoys the high life, as he puts it about exceeding his powers as king, I have no desire to resume my travels. And so by various skullduggery and sense of the limits, Charles II lives out his reign and has a dog named after him. He liked to breed them. It also happens to look like him, but I don't think that's why. And then his brother James II takes over, who is cut in the stamp of Charles I and pushes too far and is deposed and has to leave. And then you get William and Mary and so on. And with them you get the Bill of Rights, the British Bill of Rights, 100 years before the American one, which lays out such principles as no taxation without representation and the right to bear arms. Now, the English Bill of Rights is except for those stinking Catholics. So, again, there are improvements that still need to be made in the law, but it's in there, the right to bear arms as a fundamental British principle. But by the time you get the Hanovers, George II and George III in particular, they realize that a frontal assault on Parliament is a one-way ticket out of the country or possibly onto the scaffold. So they come up with a different approach. Instead of breaking Parliament, instead of ravishing Parliament, we'll seduce it with honours and titles and lucrative posts and, bags full of money, if it comes to that, if that's what it takes. We will make Parliament subordinate to the executive, but we'll destroy the substance and leave the form in place. We will create a court party in Parliament so large that for all practical purposes the will of the king is law. And this approach was on the way to succeeding. If it weren't for the American Revolution, maybe it would have succeeded. But the American Revolution delivers a salutary shock to the British, including thinking that in significant part the revolutionaries were right in their complaints. And so you see after the late 18th century, and that resolution that the power of the crown ought to diminish, well, it does diminish. Parliament becomes much stronger in Britain, and you get this high noon of parliamentary democracy where governments fall. There's a great deal of MP independence, and the state shrinks in Britain. In Victorian times, it's down to about 10% of GDP. And again, if you read the Sherlock Holmes stories, for instance, you see a world in which widespread, unregistered, uncontroversial civilian ownership of firearms is taken for granted. Watson has a revolver. He brings it with him. Nobody thinks it's odd. Conan Doyle's readers didn't go, holy cow, the Wild West, who is this maniac? You get a system of government in which fundamentally the rights of the people are secure. Government does not do very much to them. There isn't even compulsory education in England until 1870. The England that launches the cultural revolution, the industrial revolution, dominates the world culturally, dominates the world militarily, is clearly the center of the world is London in the mid-19th century, is a place without compulsory schooling. And yet it is a place with extremely high literacy rates because the English do it for themselves. They do not wait to be told what to do. And Canada in 1867 gets a constitution that is, quote, similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, which is a very interesting passage in our constitution, given that if you look at the thing for 10 seconds, you see it's very different. It's written, which the British one isn't. It's federal, which the British one isn't. So what does this phrase mean? It means that this is a place of liberty under law where sovereignty comes from the people and their rights cannot be infringed. This was the understanding of Sir John A. Macdonald and the people who made Canada. If you look at the Confederation debates, which this being Canada were not published until very recently when William Gardner, Janet Eisenstadt and company put them out in abridged form, you read through them and you see speaker after speaker will stand up in the Nova Scotia legislature or the Canadian, the province of Canada legislature and say, I have the rights of Englishmen. I am a free man. And on both sides of Confederation, people will say, we must confederate to preserve our British liberties. And someone else will say, no, we must avoid confederation to preserve our British liberties. It's the punchline over and over again. Everybody understood that this is what is happening. In fact, there is a famous court case, it's back in 1835, with Joseph Howe, who will play a major role in bringing self-government to Nova Scotia shortly after. But he's a newspaper publisher, and he has been criticizing the colonial administration. He has been tearing great big strips off them for being corrupt idiots, which they are. And so he is charged with libel. And the judge tells the jury, truth is no defense. Under British law, if he has libeled these people and damaged their reputation, it doesn't matter whether what he said was right or not. He's guilty. But Howe addresses the jury, and he says, strike down this law. It is against the rights of free men. He says to them, and this is the kind of language that you would be amazed to hear anybody say today, will you permit the sacred fire of liberty brought by your ancestors from England to be trampled out. And the jury says no. The jury nullifies the law. They say it doesn't matter that it was passed by Parliament according to the procedures that Parliament passes. This law is contrary to the rights of free people, and therefore it cannot stand. And that is how libel law gets changed in what will later become Canada. So far, so good, but we haven't got ourselves to Harper yet. Because in the 20th century, this triumph of parliamentary government in Britain takes an unfortunate turn. Because Parliament becomes effectively supreme, the balance of power breaks down in a way that looks initially quite innocent. Because Parliament's the popular branch. The Parliament will never tear free from the people. But more and more, the Prime Minister becomes a member of Parliament. There's no rule that the Prime Minister has to be a member of Parliament. In Victorian England, they frequently weren't. But more and more, it must be an MP. It can't be a member of the House of Lords. And the executive descends down into the legislature and then gradually does what the Hanovers failed to do and draws the legislature up after it. Because the Prime Minister is, of course, the leading figure in Parliament, but also the head of the executive branch for all practical purposes. Of course, the Queen remains the head of state and therefore the head of everything. But the Prime Minister is in a kind of conflict of interest because the job of the legislature is to control the executive. And yet his great plans, or her great plans, and all those campaign promises, this is true of premiers as well, depend upon the legislature being tame, upon the legislature passing omnibus bills, upon the legislature not scrutinizing the budget. You know, there was a rule in the federal parliament until 1968 that the various parts of the budget pertaining to particular areas had to be scrutinized by the various committees, and they would have to report it back to the House. Well, in 1968, the rule was if the committees don't look at it, they are deemed to have looked at it by May 1st. And this is great for the Prime Minister because people stop looking at the budget. It's great for government MPs because they don't have to annoy the Prime Minister by looking through the books and going, you're complete idiots, this will never work. And opposition MPs are freed from all this tedium that gets them nowhere, and they can go off and mount slashing rhetorical attacks in the hope that their party will, by winning a majority in the legislature, capture the executive branch, which has become the holy grail because it now has virtually unlimited power. And so we find ourselves in a situation now where this sort of the second wave of the Hanover attempt has largely succeeded. To the point, I have a bee in my bonnet about this, and some people think I'm just weird, but you're here, so you must be weird too, so good, join with me on this. The phrase, the Harper government, or the Prentice government, or the Wynne government. No, the government is the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Okay? The legislative branch makes rules, the executive carries them out, the judicial branch settles quarrels about them. That's the government. What you have is the Prentice ministry or the Prentice administration. But this is increasingly lost on us because, among other things, if you take a look at your legislature and look at the cabinet, how many cabinet members are there? And how many members of the government caucus? At one point in Ontario, when I counted this up, when the Wynne had a minority, almost every member of her caucus was also a minister or a secretary of state or a parliamentary secretary. In short, the biggest single group in the legislature was the executive party. And under those circumstances, the legislature does not check the executive. It's just a stepping stone to it. And again, the other parties do not aspire to restore the legislature. They aspire to take it over so they can be the executive branch, which is where all the good stuff is. And I should note, ministers, parliamentary secretaries, secretaries of state get extra money. There is cash on the barrel if you make it into that select group of people who absolutely reliably support the Premier or the Prime Minister. It can be a significant sum. It's one of the odd things about the federal parliament in particular is that everybody who becomes an MP gets a big pay raise or takes a big pay cut. There are people, if they're high-powered lawyers, what they make as an MP is a lot less than they made in the law firm. But if they're school teachers or farmers or all those other things, lawyers, I realize there are a lot of lawyers, but almost anybody else are making a living like they'll never make again in their lives. And then they get that extra $16,000 or $20,000, think of the difference that makes in somebody's life. So yes, you go along with the executive branch. And this is partly why the Americans, because they saw this coming, made the rule that no member of the legislature can have an executive branch appointment. And what is happening to us as a result is that we simply have lost control of our legislatures. They are whizzing around doing all kinds of things. The number of examples I find in the paper are too voluminous, and I realize that my time is virtually gone here. But the executive branch now does as it will. This fourth branch fusion of the parliamentary elite and the top of the civil service are passing laws and regulations and spending money in ways that are not controlled by anybody. And they are suspending many of the rights of due process. These human rights commissions that don't have to follow normal rules of evidence. Regulatory bodies that increasingly make decisions and have procedures for punishing you. All these kinds of things that happen without the protections of Magna Carta. And as a result of this, we're in a situation now where the rules, you think about the things in Magna Carta, security of the person, due process, property rights, representative self-government. These are the pillars and foundations that hold up the roof so that there is room in our society, so that air gets in, so that we can do things, we can dream, we can act on our dreams, we can get together with our fellows, so that we can care for the less fortunate through private charity, so that we can engage in educational initiatives, so that we can protect cultural treasures. And yet, the pillars are being knocked out, the foundations are being destroyed, and people believe the roof will stay up anyway. And I think of a line from C.S. Lewis talking about morals, but I think it applies here. And again, I think there's a profound moral content to the rules of liberty, because it is only by having space that humans can flourish, that they can become what they are meant to be. You know, charity is twice blessed. It blesses the recipient and the giver. Government welfare is twice cursed. Again, I won't give that whole speech right now, but I think there's something very important here. And Lewis said when people talk about transvaluing all values, as opposed to examining your conscience and asking if you're really living up to your values, it said it's the difference between a man who says to us, you like your vegetables moderately fresh, why not grow your own and have them perfectly fresh, and a man who says, throw away that loaf and try eating bricks and centipedes instead. And when you start bringing in these collective rights, and these rights that you are guaranteed great things will happen to you, but there's no actual mechanism for getting them. These are bricks and centipedes in terms of rights. And as long as people believe that innovation is great, every government budget, if you look at it, you got to fight through a ton of stuff to get to that point where they tell you what they're spending and what they're taking in. And all that stuff is the new things they've done. Exciting initiative here. This will change your life. This will help this group. This will revitalize the economy. New, different, change. I don't care. They've been in power 10 years and they give you 40 pages of new stuff they've done. You know, at what point do they start undoing mistakes? At what point do they start restoring things that were working perfectly well until some meddling fool started to tamper with them? You never hear that stuff because everybody thinks innovation is good. But that is probably true of operating systems. I am actually looking forward to Windows 10. But when it comes to liberty under law, we have a system that has worked not just for 800 years, but for 1,200 years. Because when people look back to Hengist, what they're saying is the Anglo-Saxon system, the rights of the ordinary people were protected. The king was not a tyrant. Your possessions were safe. You had a say in how you were governed. And life could be pretty tough. But the ideal was upheld in practice a great deal of the time. By Alfred the Great, I didn't tell the cake story, but some other time. By Canute even, the Danish interloper was a good king. And it has made a society that is prosperous, that is culturally dynamic, and that is militarily strong. As President John Quincy Adams once reminded Congress, liberty is power. This is why we have a society in which people are free to criticize and complain, not just us, but people whose views are entirely contrary to our own. And people say, yeah, it's great, but if we just throw away the food and start eating the bricks and centipedes, we'll be even more prosperous, even more culturally dynamic, even safer in the world. But there is no historical reason to think that is true. There's no example of this working. There are plenty of examples of it not working. The Anglosphere miracle that Daniel Hannan talks about, this is the culture that everybody's trying to emulate, the one that embarrasses people into seeking good government, into trying to protect their citizens. Because people say, well, if you're so great, why do the English have all this and you don't? Why do the Americans have all this? Why do the Canadians have all this? Why is Canada in the G7? And all these other countries just can't get it going. And the answer is because in those countries, people are crushed between coercion from above and anarchy from below. But in the free countries, in the Anglosphere in particular, where people have had this room, they have learned the habits of trust. They have learned the habits of cooperation. They have learned the habit of self-criticism and innovation. And I'm going to, when someone says they're going to be brief, it's time to pull the plug out. But I will say one more thing. Our Kickstarter project, to me, is a vindication of this. Because we said we want to tell the story of the people's freedom. We want to do it with the people's backing. And we asked people, please, believe in the project. And when I believe in the project, I mean, give us money. And of course, some of these people were people who couldn't say no, like my brother and sister. Obviously, they had to give me money. There were other people who knew us and said, yeah, okay, I think this guy's good for that. But then they would pass on the word to their friends, and their friends would believe them. And we had an extraordinary, Mark Stein wrote about this last Thursday. We were on track to make it, and then Mark Stein wrote about it, and we had a huge surge of people. Some of them put in their note, I don't know you from Adam. I'm only doing this because Mark said to. But they trust him, and he trusts us, and now we're going to keep the pledge. They're going to get the documentary. You're going to get the documentary. You believe. This can't happen in a lot of parts of the world. There was one guy, I got to the radio station where I do this appearance every Monday morning, and the producer came up to me with $75 in cash. And he said, yeah, a guy came by with $75 for your project. So this guy, he didn't just believe I'd make the project. He believed he could give a producer cash. No receipt, no nothing. And the producer would give it to me. And he did. And if you want to live in that kind of society, where people trust their fellows and their right to do it, you have to live in a society which is supported by the rights that were put in Magna Carta and defended for 8 centuries. Time and again they were challenged, time and again they were defended. They are under siege again. Now it's our turn to defend them, including by passing on the story. And if we do it, the kind of society that we live in and that we cherish will survive down through succeeding centuries. And that is how you get from Hengist to Harper, and how you get from Harper on into a future that is worthy of this story and of our past.